I'm first going to read it. Date September 27, 2019. Comment AD 134431 regarding 1673 risk-based capital requirements for companies significantly engaged in insurance activities. Quote, this is a follow-up to my earlier comment. I did discuss concerns regarding the terminology building block approach. Despite more than 2 years of attempting to go through official congressional channels, it seems that yesterday the Senate saw fit to pass this S-737 Building Blocks of STEM Act. It was their decision to ignore years' worth of efforts to report on important matters concerning the use of children in connection with finance schemes and agree to pass this. That they did not demand a roll call vote now implicates every member of the Senate. It is important to contextualize this in an appropriate manner. Under what terms does the Federal Reserve develop policy? To whom is it beholden? Communication, which actually had the best interest of America's children at the forefront, would not have permitted these sorts of correlations. The Federal Reserve needs to be communicating important policy guidelines and timelines with members of the federal legislature, and we need to reciprocate by not attempting to pass through a hedge using children on something as important as what is being discussed concerning America's financial future. There was a 7-year note auctioned yesterday that's due for settlement on Monday. Who's banking the next 7 years on America's children in this manner? I consider this preventative if the Federal Reserve acts appropriately. Let the service notice that someone paid attention and intends to act. 1:07 p.m. Central Standard Time, September 27, 2019. How to follow up on this? Last night there was an announcement, presumably at least, that there are subpoenas in an investigation of 43 teachers from Mexico that were kidnapped. I tried to write a report last autumn as a follow-up to a request for an investigation in 2016. See, in 2016, before those teachers were kidnapped, there was another kidnapping that occurred in Saudi Arabia. That kidnapping ended up resulting in the execution of 3 men and a fourth man, along with 43 other men that had been deemed to be low-level drug dealers or some sort of criminal connected to the drug trade, along with men that were identified as clerics but accused of acts of terrorism. I understood that this was connected to what later ended up being reported as the kidnapping of those 43 teachers as part of somebody's macabre nuclear paradigm that has literally leveraged the education of children, especially public education, as part of a form of pensioneering. No teachers union has decided to break ranks with the police pension rackets that actually provide them with their benefits, even if they go out on the streets with their own students and claim they're so concerned about racial justice. This has been going on for years. And meanwhile, I've watched this entire election season, while senators especially, but not exclusively, and the president especially, but not exclusively, and people from both parties, for years, dangle children and the livelihoods of children in front of each other as part of their electioneering. They never, ever expose what they're actually doing. They keep doing this. And meanwhile, they present a situation globally where people are intentionally put into poverty and are intentionally subjected to completely arbitrary political reprisal, where they are told and compelled to accede to processes of exploiting their children in order to get their basic needs met. I contend that those teachers were kidnapped and they've been harvested by narco-terrorists, and that the government knows. I believe Texas knows. As a matter of fact, I believe yesterday I found the information connected to the specific banking institution that has been playing that game for a very, very long time. It's part of what they consider to be their model. This is how they do business. This is how they get energy. And you're supposed to understand it from a particular perspective of when something dies, then you claim it as your capture and it resurrects. And the process of the conveyance, usually accompanying somebody's consummation of a contract, is supposed to feel good. I watched during the 2008 presidential election as the means were set up to murder scores of women on the US Mexico border, primarily working in maquiladoras. That investigation went for a while, but then it disappeared. It's the same thing they're doing right now. It's the same narco terrorist and bioterrorist that are responsible for trying to use COVID 19 as political leverage, including when it comes to reports on the number of children that got sick because they tried to go back to school. Somebody used that in an attempt to code another paradigm through strategic, frivolous litigation engaged through the court system here in Texas that was aimed to bind opposition to be made into literal slaves for them to harvest for policy, because it really does appear that in order to get elected, you have to pretty much be devoid of the capacity to compose and follow through on policy development of your own. That's the best I can say right now. What is the Federal Reserve doing? Is anybody intending to hold accountable the people that intentionally orchestrated and engineered this crisis? You know, just yesterday I found information that spoke specifically about how during the 2008 financial crisis, there were all kinds of people, including especially in the financial sector, that were so alarmed and horrified that while what was going on with the financial sector was going on, and while we needed to bail out all those banks, AIG had contract clauses requiring them to give executive compensation bonuses to people in their organization. They were contractually bound, even during a crisis, to give them executive compensation. And while we've been dealing with COVID 19, and even after last year, the Federal Reserve went through a public comment period speaking about very important matters, and there were criticisms at that time about failure to deal with executive compensation and the means by which it could be used in an effort to torture people into acquiring medical billing and coding records that are used to extort them and their children into providing sexual acts as compensation for others. And it is availed of by people during their election campaigns. Despite that, and despite being in a crisis like COVID 19, the Federal Reserve, just within the last 2 months, had another public comment period about executive compensation. Nowadays, XCOM doesn't have to be actual monetary, so it can be reported and tracked. That's what they did in the last 10 years. And they thought that they would just torture us into keeping the silence. You know, don't disclose. It's confidential. And they're hooking children up at younger and younger ages to be made commercially, sexually viable. Who are these executives that believe they're entitled to executive compensation? And who are the criminals that think that the entirety of our economy is supposed to be orchestrated to pay off pimps and drug dealers that infiltrate the government? I guess somebody will figure it out when they're ready, right?